Johnny Carson spent 30 years ruling late-night television. He wasn't just a host, he was the gatekeeper of American comedy. A single appearance on Carson's stage could transform an unknown comic into an overnight superstar. Robin Williams, Ellen DeGeneres, and Joan Rivers all soared with his blessing. But there was one man Johnny quietly refused to anoint, a comic who would go on to dominate television, redefine sitcoms, and become the highest-paid comedian of his time, Jerry Seinfeld. To the public, it looked puzzling. Why would Carson, champion of comedy, never fully endorse the star of the show about nothing? Behind the curtain, the answer was personal, complicated, and revealing. Throughout the late 1980s and early 90s, Seinfeld became the new face of stand-up. His observational humor broke through mainstream television in a way few had ever achieved. Audiences loved his clean delivery, sharp insights, and quirky onstage persona. But Johnny Carson never warmed to him. Unlike up-and-comers whom Johnny nurtured, Jerry never truly sat in that coveted seat of approval. There was no glowing monologue, no Johnny stamp of validation. Industry insiders began whispering that it wasn't about Jerry's act, it was about Jerry himself. And then, in 1993, the true rift became undeniable. Jerry Seinfeld, then at the absolute peak of his fame, was 38 years old. His show Seinfeld was a cultural juggernaut. Thursday nights belonged to him. Critics hailed him as a comedic genius, and that's when he began a romance that stunned even tolerant Hollywood. Seinfeld met Shoshana Lonstein, just 17 years old at the time, while she was still a senior at the prestigious Dalton School in Manhattan. Within months, the two were inseparable. Tabloids lit up with photographs of the teenage student and the almost 40-year-old comedian walking city streets, attending events and traveling. America watched with discomfort as Jerry insisted the relationship began as just friendship until her 18th birthday. But to many, including Carson, the optics were damning. Carson was no stranger to the messy personal lives of celebrities. In fact, he himself lived through headline-grabbing divorces and gossip. But this situation was different. Close friends revealed Johnny found the age gap unacceptable. To him, dating someone who hadn't even graduated high school wasn't just poor judgment, it was disgraceful. One insider recalled Johnny muttering backstage, "Parents trust us. This isn't trust, it's exploitation." The Tonight Show usually thrived on mixing edgy news with comedy. But Carson made one thing clear: Seinfeld's relationship was off-limits. When writers pitched jokes, Johnny refused. When a punchline once fell flat in rehearsal, he ordered that no more references to Jerry's love life be written at all. Carson's decision wasn't about protecting Seinfeld, it was about refusing to legitimize something he believed violated the unspoken rules of stardom, that fame should never normalize questionable morality. At the time, not even the mainstream press could ignore it. People magazine ran a now infamous cover story titled "The Graduate," a headline that underlined the irony. The fictional film was about an older woman seducing a just-graduated young man. But Jerry's real-life involvement reversed the roles. An older man still shaping his career with a teenager just beginning adulthood. While audiences still laughed at Seinfeld's sitcom every week, whispers followed. Carson, then in his final seasons as late-night royalty, took silent satisfaction in staying above the noise. He didn't ridicule Jerry directly, he didn't feud on air, but his silence was louder than words. And in Johnny's world, that silence meant everything. Why does this matter? Because Carson's judgment shaped careers for decades. He wasn't just a host, he was a moral compass for the stage he ran. By denying Seinfeld his full approval, Carson sent a quiet message to the industry. Success didn't excuse everything. Jerry went on to extraordinary fame without Carson's backing, of course. His sitcom became legendary, his fortune enormous. But in the lore of late night, one truth still lingers. He was the comic Johnny Carson never truly accepted. For Johnny, comedy was sacred, and when the laughter faded, what mattered most was integrity. From cold-hearted legends like Joan Crawford to bullies like Sinatra, from world-class egos like Orson Welles to troubling behaviors from Mickey Rooney, and now Jerry Seinfeld's scandal, Carson's private list revealed far more than gossip. It revealed what truly disgusted the quiet king of late night: cruelty, arrogance, dishonesty, and broken boundaries. In his silence about Jerry Seinfeld, Johnny delivered his verdict without ever saying a word. Carson's blacklist began in Hollywood's golden age, with movie stars like Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Orson Welles, Bette Davis, and Mickey Rooney. Each of them revealed cracks in their polished images, behavior Johnny quietly refused to forgive. But as his Tonight Show entered its final decade, a new generation of performers came to dominate television. And Carson, though nearing retirement, continued to measure talent with the same cold precision. And that's where one name surprised everyone: Jerry Seinfeld. The man who would become television's most profitable comic never received Johnny's blessing. And to those who knew Carson well, the reason was simple: Jerry had all of the wit and none of the warmth. By the early 1990s, Seinfeld was unstoppable. Thursday nights belonged to Jerry. Critics hailed him as the observational genius of his generation. Jerry's nothing had become everything. But Johnny, who had launched countless comics with a single invitation to sit on his couch, never offered Seinfeld the same embrace. Unlike his glowing support for Robin Williams or Ellen DeGeneres, Carson kept Seinfeld at a cool distance. To the audience, it looked like an oversight. Privately, it was anything but. In 1993, Seinfeld made headlines for his relationship with Shoshana Lonstein, a 17-year-old high school student. Jerry was 38 at the time, nearly 2 decades older, and already one of television's most visible stars. Photographs of the two began filling gossip magazines and tabloids. Jerry insisted they were just friends until her 18th birthday, but the public largely wasn't buying it. And for Johnny Carson, who valued a certain quiet dignity in celebrity life, the optics were unacceptable. Carson refused to allow topical jokes about the relationship on his monologues. Writers who typically pushed risque material were told flatly to drop it. Friends close to him recall Johnny muttering, "Parents trust this medium. That isn't trust, it's tacky." For Carson, who had spent 30 years protecting The Tonight Show's reputation as a family-friendly refuge, Jerry had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But there was more to Carson's quiet dislike than Seinfeld's public scandal. Backstage, Jerry carried himself with detachment, always punctual, forever prepared, professional to the letter, but he rarely engaged with anyone beyond what was required. Crew members described him as cordial but cold. There was no extra thank you, no curiosity about the lives of staff members, the invisible army that made television possible. Carson, in sharp contrast, had built deep respect among his team for decades. He learned stagehands' names. He paused to ask assistants about their kids. For Johnny, that wasn't just manners, it was the heart of television. He believed greatness required gratitude. So when Jerry treated The Tonight Show like it was simply another box to tick, Carson remembered. Johnny loved comics who could mix brilliance with humanity. David Letterman's self-deprecation, Jay Leno's work ethic, Joan Rivers' openness. Seinfeld, however, came across as clinical. One night during a panel discussion, Jerry tossed off a dismissive remark about Carson favorites, casually suggesting Letterman and Leno were trying too hard to win audiences. The Tonight Show audience laughed at the sharp delivery, but in the green room, silence dropped like a curtain. Carson, visibly stiff, forced the thinnest of smiles. For him, disrespect wasn't wit, it was insecurity dressed as arrogance. Privately, Carson commented, "The great ones don't tear others down. They don't need to." Another chasm between the two men lay in their attitudes toward success. Carson had made a staggering fortune throughout his career, but modesty was his shield. He considered wealth something to keep private, never a centerpiece of his persona. Seinfeld, however, wore his wealth openly. Luxury cars, record deals, massive salaries. It was as if affluence had become part of the act. Johnny saw that as indulgence without dignity, a showboating version of comedy that felt hollow to him. Years into retirement, when asked about Jerry Seinfeld, Carson gave one of his final public judgments. He said softly, "Some comedians understand that with success comes responsibility. Others just understand the success. It wasn't meant as a punchline." It was his verdict. Jerry Seinfeld may have conquered television, but to Johnny Carson, he remained a comedian without layers, all surface and no substance. A man who could make the world laugh, but who in Johnny's eyes had failed the deeper test of character. From Crawford's cruelty to Sinatra's bullying, from Welles's unchecked ego to Davis's sharp tongue, from Rooney's dangerous behavior to Seinfeld's cold detachment, Johnny's blacklist was never about ratings. It was about what he valued most: humility, kindness, and honor beneath the spotlight. Because for Johnny Carson, comedy wasn't just about laughter, it was about trust, and those who broke that trust were never forgiven. One of the biggest differences between Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld came down to money. Both men were enormously successful. Both earned fortunes most Americans couldn't even imagine. But their approach to wealth revealed just how far apart they were, not just as performers but as people. Johnny accumulated hundreds of millions during his decades at NBC, yet he wore that success lightly. His homes were nice, his cars polished, but he never flaunted them. He believed talking about money made a comedian less relatable, less real. "You don't get funnier when your garage gets bigger," Johnny once told his staff. To him, connection with the ordinary was the foundation of humor. Carson grew up during the Great Depression in Nebraska. Those years shaped him. They taught thrift, restraint, perspective. Even as television's highest-paid entertainer, he avoided showy displays. His longtime producer Peter Lassily once remarked, "Yes, Johnny enjoyed nice things, but he'd never brag." He hated that kind of talk. To Carson, great comics, George Burns, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, never let their wealth overshadow their humanity. Their laughter felt grounded in ordinary life, maintaining that everyman quality was essential. Lose it, Carson believed, and you lost the laughter too. Jerry Seinfeld saw things differently. His post-sitcom legend wasn't just built on jokes, it was built on wealth itself. His famous Porsche collection, over 100 cars, was celebrated almost as much as his comedy. He traveled by private jet. Reporters openly discussed his $100 million syndication checks, and Jerry didn't shy away from it. In fact, he leaned into it. Entire shows like Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee were built literally around his luxury lifestyle, turning automobiles and affluence into part of the punchline. Audiences, especially younger ones, found it aspirational. But to Carson, who disdained flaunting riches, it only highlighted a disconnect. As Johnny once muttered to Ed McMahon, "The audience can smell when you've lost touch with real life. And when that happens, you stop being funny. Then you're just rich." But the real insult came years later, long after Johnny had stepped away from the stage. For 3 decades, Carson had perfected the talk show format. The desk, the couch, the monologue, the artful interview. It was more than entertainment, it was architecture. Letterman, Leno, Fallon, Kimmel, all traced their shows back to Carson's blueprint. Then in 2012, Jerry Seinfeld launched his own interview project, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. Praised as clever and authentic, Jerry made sure to underline one point in interviews: his was different. He dismissed traditional late-night shows as tired, insincere, and, in his words, fake enthusiasm. "I don't want to talk to actors about movies I haven't seen," Jerry quipped. "That's not real." He never mentioned Carson by name, but insiders knew. The message was unmistakable. The format Johnny had invented, his life's crowning achievement, was old, phony, and no longer worth a real comedian's time. For Carson, who had given the late-night format its dignity and shaped 3 generations of comedians, Jerry's critique stung. A close friend later revealed how Johnny felt. This was the guy who built his career on that couch, on the very stage Johnny gave him access to, and now he's using his fame to dismiss it. It wasn't explosive hatred. It was deeper than that. It was disappointment. For Carson, Seinfeld symbolized a cultural shift. Comedy that was brilliant on stage, but self-absorbed off it. Fame without humility, wealth without discretion, success without gratitude, and that made him one of the last and most surprising names on Johnny's private blacklist. For Carson, the true mark of greatness had never been money or fame. It was humility, authenticity, and respect for the craft. 3 things Jerry Seinfeld, despite all his success, never delivered in Johnny's eyes. And that's the heart of Carson's story. A man who saw behind the laughter and who wasn't afraid to quietly decide for himself who truly deserved the spotlight. To Johnny Carson, The Tonight Show wasn't just another program. It was America's nightly town square. From assassinations and wars to moments of joy and triumph, late-night television carried the nation through decades of change. Johnny saw the role as serious, a responsibility as much as an entertainment. So when Jerry Seinfeld dismissed the traditional talk show as fake enthusiasm and superficial banter, Carson felt it cut deep. This wasn't just criticism of a format. It was a rejection of the very craft Johnny had spent his life perfecting. What made it sting even more? Carson had once given Jerry that exact platform, The Tonight Show stage, to prove himself when he was still hustling through comedy clubs. As with so many comedians of his generation, those first appearances introduced Seinfeld to America, to then turn around years later and dismiss the very engine that made his career felt to Carson's circle like betrayal. Johnny may never have lashed out directly, but friends recalled his sharp aside. Without talk shows, Jerry Seinfeld would still be working pizza parlors in Long Island. Delivered with Carson's trademark smirk, the humor hit a genuine hurt. But beyond ego, their philosophies of comedy revealed an even greater divide. Carson celebrated comics who bared their souls, Richard Pryor's raw honesty about race and addiction, George Carlin's fearless social satire, Robin Williams' manic eruptions of brilliance covering a tender core of pain. These weren't just jokes, they were revelations about life. By contrast, Jerry built his career by avoiding those very depths. He once flatly told an interviewer, "I'm not interested in feelings, I'm interested in funny." His clean observational wit was polished, calculated, and proudly superficial. It made millions laugh, but rarely made them feel. For Carson, laughter was the first step, but not the finish line. Great comedy, he often said, should bring connection, discomfort, or even healing. Jerry's perfection of jokes about airline peanuts and waiting rooms left Carson cold. To him, it skirted around the true power of humor. While Seinfeld represented technical polish without emotional weight, another comedian caught Carson's admiration even in retirement: Norm Macdonald. Johnny rarely praised comedians publicly after leaving television, but he made an exception here. He reportedly told close friends, "Norm is the only one who reminds me of myself." Why Norm? His fearless silences, his dry timing, his refusal to bend even if it meant bombing. Norm carried the lineage of Jack Benny and other old-school comics whom Carson revered. Deliberate, uncompromising, authentic. The ultimate contrast came years after Johnny's death, when Norm Macdonald passed away in 2021. Tributes flooded in from every corner of the comedy world: Letterman, O'Brien, Sandler. But Jerry Seinfeld? Total silence. No tweet, no statement, nothing. To Carson loyalists, that silence confirmed what Johnny had always suspected, that Jerry lacked generosity of spirit, the humility to honor those who had elevated the craft. "You can judge a comedian by how they speak about other comedians," Carson once told a producer. For many, Jerry's silence on Norm spoke volumes.